Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul, and I hope you've been well. Today I'll be talking about how love, by which I mean, of course, eros, real Platonic love or desire, is the cause of evil, and why that is actually one of the pillars of Platonic hope. You may have noticed I'm kind of fond of describing Platonic love as deeply subversive. And this is a big part of what I'm talking about here today. Plato's real teaching on love, which is, as we've seen, really kind of a far cry from the popular conception of Platonic love, really kind of upsets what you might call common sense morality and spirituality, I think. Though at the same time, it has a way of kind of echoing deeply inside of us. It really kind of replaces traditional, in a way, kind of common sense bipolarity or dualism, if you like, with a sort of spiritual or moral unipolarity or monism. So what I mean by all that is this. It seems a near universal, or at the very least, quite common human tendency to associate love, at least to some extent or in some way, with good, and hate with evil, and to take these as two basically opposite but equal forces at work in us. In us, if not in the actual cosmos itself. The light and dark, for example, embodied by Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu in Zoroastrianism and many other places. These sort of yin and yang pairs of contraries seen as basically woven into the fabric of things that take their turns, in a way, influencing us, and that our thought and actions naturally seem to oscillate between. And we see, of course, that Enlightenment culture, science and technology, don't seem to make this tendency go away. It tends to resurface, as we see in the popular culture of our own time, perhaps especially strikingly, for example, in the Star Wars franchise. This is why I keep referring to Diotima's teaching in the Symposium as a bit startling, that all humans desire is nothing but the good. It upsets this everyday or common sense or, in a way, universal understanding of what's at work in life. And I think it must really be rooted in this equally startling principle at the heart of what you could call Platonic metaphysics, although, of course, the term metaphysics didn't exist in Plato's time. But he does talk, as we saw in the Republic, about the good being the fundamental cause of everything. So clearly, Platonism is fundamentally unipolar or monistic. But that said, of course, at the same time, there is a certain bipolarity or dualism at work in Plato also. In fact, I think many people would even see Plato as fundamentally dualistic, although I think they'd be wrong in that. But there is for sure a certain fuzziness here, as Plato seems to clearly recognize not just the existence of evil alongside good in the human realm, but in the cosmic as well. To some extent, of course, the ideal is good and the sensible is evil for Plato. And we saw also that Aristotle, Plato's student for more than 2 decades, also considered these two principles in Platonism, the one and the dyad of great and small, to be also the principles of good and evil. And so it seems probably the truth of Platonism is that it is or strives to be a monism that contains dualism within it, that somehow good and evil are contained within the good, something which I think is actually probably closely akin to what Hegel was trying to express with his difficult principle of the identity of identity and non-identity. I feel this is kind of stuff that can expose itself to ridicule, but it can also be deeply consciousness expanding. Anyway, actually, interestingly enough, I think it's also probably more accurate to say that this doctrine, paradoxical or at least difficult though it may sound, that this polarity of good and evil somehow exists within the good itself, is actually universal in some way, rather than the strict dualism we were just talking about. Like in Chinese philosophy, for example, the yin and yang exist together within this sort of unknowable but deeper principle of harmony, taiji. In Zoroastrianism, it is often depicted as a kind of paragon of dualistic system. Ahura Mazda is actually really the all-powerful creator God, and he ultimately prevails over the evil Angra Mainyu. So we're not really talking exactly about opposite poles. And then, of course, in Star Wars, sorry, I've got an itchy eye. In Star Wars, the Emperor is ultimately defeated. Palpate this, Palpatine. What's really subversive, I think, about Diotima and Plato is that they were coming out and expressing this idea in a much clearer way than it had ever been expressed before. And this, as I'll explain, makes all the difference. Anyway, so what this all means is that there's a sense in which evil is illusory for Plato, or at least that it's not substantial in itself, but is rather a kind of falling away from the good. And so when we come to explaining human motivation, the good for Plato must be the ultimate explanation there also. And evil must be explained in terms of the good, as a kind of falling away from it. And indeed, we saw that what really enables Plato to say that all that humans desire is the good is this idea that this human desire for the good is essentially unconscious. And the fact that our desire for the good is essentially unconscious, that we're not really able to adequately conceptualize the good, makes all the difference. This is why we spend most of our lives chasing after images of the good only, things that embody it in particular ways, that remind us of the good or trigger our unconscious knowledge of it. These things that trigger us in this way cause an obsessiveness in us. We pursue them with a single-mindedness that ends up doing damage along the way because we don't see them as incomplete. This is the great theme, I think, of Dante's Inferno, that traces sin or evil to deficient love, or a really deficient knowledge of the object of love, of the good. Dante, who never could have read Plato, and yet digested him so thoroughly because the philosophic culture of his time was so deeply Platonic. It had been shaped by these intermediaries, the pseudo-Dionysius and Augustine, many, many others, who had either read Plato or Plotinus or other pagan Neoplatonists, or who had read and been shaped by the pseudo-Dionysius or Augustine, or read and been shaped by other intermediaries in turn. Tracing out the tradition with all these myriad streams of influence becomes extremely complex in the Middle Ages. And in a way, it's one of the things that makes the study of medieval philosophy kind of interesting. But anyway, speaking of Augustine, Augustine expresses in some particularly bold and memorable ways this ethico-spiritual monism or unipolarity, this subversive teaching in which love is the principle of evil as well as good. Most famously, he writes in his Confessions, Pondus meum amor meus, eo feror quocumque feror. My love, my eros, is my weight. Because amor was not really a typical word for Christian writers to use for love. It was more associated with the lustful kind of love that the poets talk about. So Augustine was being sort of subversive by using amor in a theological context this way. And he knew he was, because he talks about it at one point. Amor is the sole motive force in us for Augustine. And Augustine, of course, was converted to Platonism before he was converted to Christianity. And he really kind of implies in his Confessions that the former was necessary, really, for the latter, because otherwise he wouldn't have been able to understand the idea of spiritual or ideal being. Anyway, love for Augustine is never not working in us, whether we're doing good or evil. And this idea is brought out a bit more fully by Augustine in a less famous passage, a commentary on the Psalms. And here I'm using a translation from the 2012 book, In the Self's Place, The Approach of St. Augustine by the French philosopher Jean-Luc Marion. Love cannot take a vacation. For what is it that is at work, even poorly, in any man whatsoever, if not love? Give me a love on vacation. He means give me an example of a love on vacation, one which is doing nothing. Wicked deeds, acts of adultery, crimes, homicides, indulgence in luxuries. What is it that does these things, if not love? You might have remembered, if you've watched a lot of the videos in this series, that I've mentioned at least once that one of the ways real Platonic love, the doctrine of love that was first articulated by Plato and was subsequently developed over many centuries by philosophers in the Platonic tradition, one of the ways it differs from this popular or conventional conception of Platonic love is that the conventional understanding tends to see Platonic love as something kind of harmless or safe or tame, whereas love in this Platonic tradition is about the most dangerous thing there is. So where does that leave us? Is it possible that it leaves us in a kind of dark place, a place in which we find something we may have considered to be among the best things in life is actually quite threatening and frightening? I think actually quite the opposite, and here's why. In a way, of course, yes, this teaching is unsettling. It leaves us with an idea of love and of the good, actually, too, that is much more mysterious than the way we may have thought of these things. There's a kind of unknowability about these things, and a power that we feel perhaps we'll never really be able to fully grasp. But on the other hand, I think it's hard for humans to be deeply hopeful without understanding, because our freedom really depends on our knowledge. The truth sets us free, especially in the realm of existential alienation that I've been talking about so much in this series, that sense of being cut off from the world or nature, especially our own human nature, our feelings. But I also think we don't have real understanding, an explanation that really works for us, unless it explains something in terms of a single principle. It brings many phenomena in a way to one. It ties everything together. It shows the one in the many, or if you like, the many in the one. And so I don't think the traditional bipolar or dualistic spirituality or morality is actually very conducive to existential hope, unless there's a deeper unity underlying our everyday understanding of good and evil and love and hate. We sort of just have to take these things as given in the nature of things. And so we end up being stuck, I think, in a kind of fatalism. I'm thinking here, for example, of that fatalism that Achilles speaks of to Priam, or that he shows to Priam at the end of the Iliad, that I mentioned a couple of episodes ago. He talks about Zeus dispensing blessings and miseries from these two jars, and there's nothing mortals can do about it. Or of that really kind of powerful passage from Euripides' Medea that I've also mentioned in this series. Medea is enraged at Jason and kills his new wife and her own children. She presents it as a situation that just leaves her with no choice. There's no way for what you could call the light of reason to moderate or bring any kind of gentleness to her violent passion. She says, "I know what evil I intend to do, but stronger than my reasoned thought is fury, which brings the greatest evil upon men." So if we understand ourselves, we understand the psyche, perhaps even the cosmos itself, to be a kind of locus of the struggle between these opposite but equal poles of good and evil, neither of which is explicable through a third principle, then we're left in a kind of devil made me do it situation. We're less powerful than the forces at work in us. And so, what's the solution? You might be familiar with this trilogy of plays by another great Athenian dramatist, the Oresteia, or Oresteia of Aeschylus. That trilogy tells the story of this fatalistic cycle of violence with a ray of light that finally bursts in at the end, something hinted at actually by the chorus near the trilogy's beginning, which sings, "Cry, cry for death, but good win out in glory in the end." And the light comes, of course, in the form of Athena, who is brought in as judge, though I think mediator would be a better term. Anyway, yes, the principle of understanding is the principle of liberation from fatalism and the principle of hope. So Athena needs to be brought into the picture. And so it's kind of hard, in a way, not to see Diotima as some kind of incarnation of that goddess here. Because what Diotima gives us is that single principle through which we can understand ourselves, and so that we need not see ourselves as merely prone to opposite tendencies, but as having the power to see through them and thereby, in some way, free ourselves. And so this principle, of course, is love or eros. But the principle in turn of love or eros is the good. And so this ability we have to make ourselves happier and better is firstly to recognize that our true desire is for the good. And then secondly, to understand the good, to turn ourselves to it. I might add here that immediately after the passage I quoted him saying a few minutes ago about love never taking a vacation, Augustine exhorts the reader to existential freedom. He says, "Purify, therefore, your love. Water flows toward the sewer, turn it toward the garden." The psyche has the power to turn itself to the good by opening itself to the good. And how does it do this exactly? Well, that's what I'll be talking about through most of the rest of this series, which, as usual, I hope you can join me for. And until my next episode, thanks for watching.